This chilling true crime story, inspired by the works of best-selling author Gregg Olsen, delves into the double life of a man who defied his Amish roots in more ways than one. Eli's ties to the old order Amish were unraveling fast. Though he attended church a few times, his enthusiasm faded, replaced by a growing fascination with the outside world. By the summer of 1972, he was socializing with English friends, slipping behind the wheel of cars, an unthinkable rebellion in his community. His defiance sealed his fate, excommunication. But for Eli, the price of freedom was worth it. The fear of being shunned, of never sharing another meal with his family, barely fazed him. Determined to carve out a new path, he found refuge with a new order Amish family near Apple Creek, one that embraced electricity, technology, and a future far different from the one he was leaving behind. Little did they know, Eli's journey wasn't just about breaking traditions. It was about something far more sinister. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification button so you never miss another gripping unknown crime story. Leroy Chupp and his family assisted Eli in transitioning away from the old order Amish lifestyle, and Liz helped him order non-Amish clothes from a J.C. Penney catalog. Eli obtained his driver's license and purchased a 1970 Oldsmobile. Stoltzfus Farms became a common workplace for young men leaving the Amish church, including Eli's cousin Dave Stutzman, Chris Schwartzentruber, and John Yoder. Chris was directly descended from the founder of the Schwartzentruber Amish sect, and due to the practice of marrying within the small community, they often shared the same names. Even after leaving the church, Eli had a few dates with a girl named Ida Stutzman, who belonged to a Mennonite church in the area. However, Ida, who was still in love with Eli, regularly wrote him letters, urging him to return to the church, but her efforts were in vain. Eli enjoyed his newfound freedom from the strict rules of the church and casually dated other women. One of these women, Rebecca Yost, became pregnant, and Eli provided her with money for an abortion. In 1973, Eli bought his friend John Yoder a pair of red bikini underwear as a birthday gift. This was considered unusual, as the conservative Amish community forbade the wearing of underwear due to the worldly nature of elastic waistbands. In late 1974, Eli became involved with the Wayne County Sheriff's Department in apprehending a couple of farmers involved in growing and selling marijuana. Eli contacted the alleged pot farmer, pretending to seek it for headaches. After the sale was made, Eli delivered the drugs to the sheriff, leading to the swift arrest of the dealer and revealing Eli as the informant. Following this incident, Eli claimed to have received death threats and warned the sheriff and the families residing at Stoltzfus Farms. They made an effort to be watchful for any suspicious individuals, but on November 19th, Ed Stahl discovered Eli lying in a pool of blood in one of the barns. Eli claimed that two men had attacked him and struck him with rocks. He fought back, even using a pitchfork to stab one of them, but they overpowered him and stabbed him in return. He was quickly taken to the hospital, where the doctor stated that he had lost a significant amount of blood and was close to death. The sheriff's department faced criticism for involving Eli in the drug bust without providing adequate protection for him. However, it didn't take long for people to notice inconsistencies in Eli's story compared to the evidence. The cuts on his arms appeared to be cleaner than what would be expected from a violent struggle, and a straight razor stained with Eli's blood was discovered in the barn. The sheriff decided to compare the threatening letters Eli had received with his handwriting, and they matched. The typed letters were also compared to a typewriter found in Eli's room, and the match was confirmed. Eventually, Eli confessed that he had orchestrated the entire incident himself. It was a dangerous stunt that nearly cost him his life. After being released from the hospital, Eli returned to Stoltzfus Farms to recover. However, he frequently left the farm for days at a time, causing concern. During one of his absences, Mary Jane Stoll found some magazines hidden under his mattress containing explicit images of men. Mary Jane chose to burn the magazines without confronting Eli about them. On February 10, 1975, Eli was fired from Stoltzfus Farms. He claimed that he was terminated in retaliation for catching someone stealing from a farm equipment store, but that was not true. To everyone's surprise, Eli shocked the community by agreeing to return to the Schwartzentruber Amish church. He went for confession, sold his car and non-Amish clothing, was rehired as a teacher by the school board, and professed his devotion to Ida. In Ohio at that time, a blood test was required for marriage, though the Amish community did not fully understand its implications. A negative result was interpreted as God's will, indicating that the couple should not have children. Eli and Ida both had negative blood test results twice. In reality, the test was for screening potential couples for venereal diseases, and Eli had contracted syphilis. Just as Ida was losing hope of marrying Eli Stutzman, he arrived at her house with a positive test and claimed that drinking herbal tea had miraculously cured his blood. Some speculated that he had manipulated the test results, but the Amish community generally did not question such matters. Ultimately, Eli and Ida were able to marry on December 25, 1975. Only a few weeks after their marriage, Ida discovered that she was pregnant. People began to notice that Eli often left home, leaving Ida alone and uncertain of his whereabouts. On one occasion, after a night of drinking, Eli propositioned a friend who was giving him a ride home, offering him money for a sexual act. The friend rejected the offer, and Eli escalated the offer but was subsequently kicked out of the car. On September 7, 1976, Ida gave birth to a son named Daniel, with the assistance of a midwife from the community. At the baby's first doctor visit, Eli requested that Danny receive a full series of vaccinations and be circumcised, actions that were uncommon in the Schwartzentruber church. About 6 months later, the Stutzman family agreed to purchase a 95-acre farm from Chris Schwartzentruber, Eli's brother, in the upcoming spring of 1977. The family relocated to the farm and embraced their simple Amish lifestyle. Before long, they discovered that Ida was pregnant again. Despite outwardly appearing connected to his community and committed to his faith and family, Eli secretly yearned for the freedom he desired outside the church. In May, the Stutzmans visited a local bank and applied for a loan to finance the farm purchase. While Eli had been making direct payments to Daniel Schwartzentruber, the seller of the farm, it was not unusual for the Amish to secure a loan to pay the full amount. The bank considered it a low-risk loan due to the Amish community's excellent credit history and lack of other financial obligations that would hinder their mortgage payments. Since the loan did not require specific use of the funds, the bank gave the money directly to Eli. However, neither Daniel nor Ida were aware that the loan was not used to pay for the farm. On July 11, 1977, a storm hit the area. Eli informed his younger cousin, also named Eli, who was staying with them for the summer, that he had witnessed lightning striking the barn. He asked his cousin to help him find the spot where it struck and poured water on it. However, cousin Eli later stated that he didn't observe any signs of lightning damage on the barn. That evening, an attorney arrived at the farm to discuss the details of the Stutzman's will. The will stipulated that if Eli died, everything would go to Ida, and if Ida died, everything would go to Eli. If both died, everything would go to their son Danny. The attorney took notes and planned to draft the will for their signatures. Later that night, cousin Eli woke up around midnight and noticed a bright light outside. He looked out the window and saw that the barn was on fire. He rushed downstairs and found Eli outside, moving farm equipment away from the blaze. Eli instructed the young boy to run to the neighbor's house and call the fire department. As cousin Eli ran off, he discovered Ida lying on the ground. He tried to assist her, but she was unresponsive. When he informed Eli about Ida's condition upon his return, Eli instructed him to go to the neighbor's house again and call for a doctor. Neighbors Howard and Sue Snavely, awakened by the fire, contacted the fire department and went to the Stutzman farm to check on the family. Eli urgently asked Howard to help him rescue his wife from the barn, claiming she was trapped inside. They entered the barn together and found Ida lying on her back. Eli mentioned that she might have had a heart attack, and they carried her away from the fire. Howard checked for a pulse but couldn't detect one. When the fire department arrived, they worked to extinguish the fire, and Howard informed the fire chief about Ida's injuries. The chief confirmed her death after examining her. According to Eli, Ida had woken him up after the fire started, and he had instructed her to call the fire department. However, when he went to the milk barn, he found her lying on the ground, assuming she had suffered a heart attack due to the smoke. He attributed her weakened heart to a lifelong condition. Cousin Eli, unaware that Eli had called Howard for help, didn't relay this information to others. Howard noticed that Eli seemed more focused on explaining the lightning as the cause of the fire rather than showing concern for his wife and unborn child. When the sheriff arrived, the consensus was that Ida had perished in the fire. The medical examiner observed burns on her body, indicating exposure to high heat rather than direct flames. Ida had supposedly been in the milk barn for some time before being removed by Eli and Howard. She had burns on her hand, suggesting contact with something hot, and had cuts on her forehead and a laceration near her mouth. These injuries raised questions about how they occurred if she had fallen on her back. The bright red color of the blood from these injuries indicated that they happened while she was still alive. When questioned about the incident, Eli's account differed slightly. He mentioned that he had allowed Ida to retrieve some items from the milk barn before telling her to hurry. He claimed that he attempted CPR for 20 to 30 minutes when he found her and then carried her away from the barn by himself. The sheriff, unaware of Eli's troubled past and lacking additional evidence, assumed that Ida had died as a result of the fire, possibly due to her heart being unable to withstand the intense heat. The sheriff filed the report without further questioning the death. Danny, who had been sleeping in his crib during the fire, was taken to a friend's house and remained safe throughout the incident. Eli was left as a widowed father. While the Amish community, known for their trust, rallied to support the Stutzman family, some community members couldn't help but feel suspicious about Eli's account. Despite being medicated, Eli's behavior did not improve. He attended only one church service before leaving with Danny after an hour. He started attending a Mennonite church instead, and people in the community began to notice signs that he was preparing to leave. By the end of the year, Eli had sold all the dairy cows and was ready to leave the Amish church once again. He contacted his cousin for help and asked if he could visit his family in Greenville with Danny after the holidays. Eli informed his cousin that he had left the church and found a job training horses in Georgia. However, he couldn't bring Danny with him and asked if his cousin could care for him. His cousin agreed to take care of Danny. Eli spent several months in Georgia and then Florida, mostly without Danny, before returning to the farm. Upon his return, he quickly made upgrades to the farm, including adding electricity and telephone lines. He also bought a new car, shaved his face, and cut his hair short. Additionally, he began buying and trading racehorses, something that was frowned upon in the Amish community due to their opposition to gambling. Eli took a keen interest in the world of horse racing. Over the next few years, he focused on training racing horses and boasted about his skills in that area. He claimed to be well known throughout the country as someone who could tame any horse, and people from various places hired him for horse training. This allowed him to travel and explore the gay scene in different parts of the country. By this time, Eli was no longer hiding his sexual orientation. His farm became known in the gay community as a place for frequent barn parties. He rented out rooms in his farmhouse, and neighbors noticed an increase in activity on the property, predominantly with male visitors. Eli also used classified ads to meet other gay men. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, he spent most of his nights either going out with friends while neighbors babysat Danny or engaging in sexual encounters with men he met through classified ads. Some of the men who met Eli mentioned that he was attentive to Danny, ensuring that he was asleep before retiring to the master bedroom. Eli had a restless nature and didn't like staying in one place for too long. In early 1992, he decided to take Danny and move to Colorado. He sold his farm for $200,000, which upset the local Amish community as more of their land ended up in the hands of non-Amish individuals. Eli had met a man in Durango, Colorado, who owned a ranch and had a $15,000 stallion. Eli expressed his desire to start anew in Durango, explaining that he had been shunned by the Amish, which was negatively affecting Danny. He and the rancher decided to purchase a bigger ranch together, with Eli providing the down payment. They lived together with Danny for less than a year, but problems between Eli and the rancher arose almost immediately. Eli was more interested in being part of the local gay scene than maintaining a committed relationship. Concerns were raised when Eli brought Danny to parties and allowed him to behave inappropriately. Some individuals contemplated reporting the incident to authorities but refrained due to fear of their involvement in the gay party scene being questioned. By January 1983, another young man had moved into the ranch, and it appeared that he and the rancher had a better connection. During this time, Eli continued placing classified ads to meet other men and engaged in unprotected sex, despite the risks associated with the early 1980s AIDS epidemic. He would often boast about his deceased wife, Ida, but the details of her death varied in his stories. In one version, he claimed that Ida had been awake and feeding Danny when she noticed the barn on fire and went out to try to put it out herself. Some individuals even claimed that she passed away in a car accident. In February, the rancher finally gathered the courage to leave Eli. During this time, many more people in the gay community were concealing their sexual orientation, and the rancher was afraid of what would happen to Eli without him. However, he was willing to take the risk to escape the situation. Eli willingly purchased the rancher's share of the ranch for $5,000, along with an additional $5,000 worth of farm equipment. As Eli gained more freedom, his sexual desires increased. He would bring groups of men to his ranch for parties and engage in sexual encounters with men he met at bars, in parking lots, and through classified ads. In October, he attended a Halloween party dressed as an Amish man, and witnesses observed him engaging in sexual acts with men dressed in Amish attire. In November, Eli and Danny disappeared from Durango. Eli had met a man from Austin, Texas through a classified ad and moved in with him. However, their relationship didn't last long and Eli found his place. Austin was considered one of the more progressive cities in the South during the early 1980s, with a thriving gay scene and less violence towards the LGBTQ+ community. Eli became involved in the gay community, working for the Austin chapter of the Texas Gay Rodeo Association and starting his own construction business, where he employed young gay men. Meanwhile, Glenn Pritchett, born in 1961 in Logan, Utah, had a troubled past. He struggled academically, engaged in drinking and drug use as a teenager, and had multiple encounters with the law. He met Sandy Turner, who also had a history of legal troubles, and the two ran away. They got married at the age of 16 with Sandy's mother's permission. Despite his turbulent past, Glenn decided to turn his life around and join the United States Coast Guard as an electrician. He was stationed in Reedsport, Oregon, where he and Sandy had a daughter. They were then relocated to Staten Island, New York, where they had a son. However, Glenn's military career didn't go as planned, and he struggled with excessive alcohol use, leading to a drunk driving charge in 1983. After completing an alcohol abuse program, he returned home to Montana but continued to struggle with alcohol. Sandy filed for divorce and Glenn moved out of their apartment. He found work at a restaurant but frequently got into trouble for harassing Sandy and getting into fights with her new boyfriend. The police had to intervene to break up one of these fights. Glenn left town and visited family before eventually ending up in Reno. From there, he made his way to Austin, where he found a construction job working for Eli. To the surprise of his ex-wife, Glenn was the only straight man on the crew, but he seemed fine with that. Eli rented a room to Glenn, and eventually, another friend moved into the house as well. They formed a close-knit group of friends who would go out together to bars, including gay bars, even though Glenn identified as straight. Glenn enjoyed his time in Austin but expressed a desire to reconcile with his ex-wife, who was about to remarry. She wanted to move on, so she changed her phone number after Glenn continued to call her persistently. January 1985 was the last time she heard from him. On May 12, 1985, a body was discovered in a ditch on Clifton Bluff Springs Road near Boston, Texas. The body had a foul odor, initially mistaken for an animal carcass. However, upon closer inspection, it was revealed to be a decomposed human body. The unidentified man had been shot in the head and dumped in the ditch. The body, wearing only cut-off shorts, was badly decomposed, but fingerprints were obtained, and a .22 caliber round was recovered from the head. The medical examiner estimated that the man had died approximately 4 to 6 weeks prior. The investigators made several observations and faced challenges while trying to identify the body. Despite receiving suggestions from people that the victim might be a missing family member, it was determined that the body did not match anyone in the missing persons system. The discovery that the unidentified body had undergone an appendectomy further ruled out the possibility of it being a relative. Local fingerprint searches yielded no results, so the prints were sent to the FBI for a national search, which would take time. On June 3, the FBI made a match between the fingerprints and those of a man named Glenn Pritchett, who had previously joined the Coast Guard. With a name to work with, the investigators found records indicating that Glenn had been questioned about suspicious activity in a parking lot the previous December while in the company of a man named Eli Stutzman. Both individuals claimed to live at the same address on Banton Road. 2 detectives arrived at Eli's house on June 15, where they were greeted by Elijah. They informed him that they were there to investigate the murder of Glenn Pritchett. One of the detectives noted that Eli did not appear surprised by the news. Eli explained that Glenn worked for him and had been allowed to sleep on his couch in exchange for $50 per week. He stated that he hadn't seen Glenn for weeks, as Glenn had to leave for Montana due to a family emergency. Eli claimed to have dropped Glenn off at the bus station, expecting him to return after resolving the emergency. The detective asked Eli about firearms, and he admitted to owning a .22 caliber rifle and a 16-gauge shotgun. Upon examining the weapons, the detective noticed that neither had been recently fired. The interview was then moved to the police station. Now that it was confirmed that Eli owned a weapon of the same caliber as the one used to kill Glenn, he became an even more viable suspect. The detective remained unsettled by Eli's casual demeanor upon learning about his friend's murder. Most people would typically ask numerous questions about the circumstances, such as where and how the victim was found and if there were any suspects. However, Eli did not ask anything about these details. The detectives asked Eli to provide a detailed timeline of his interactions with Glenn and when Glenn had left for Montana. They also requested that he undergo a polygraph test. Eli agreed to take the test since there was no evidence to hold him and he appeared to be cooperating with the investigation. Consequently, he was released. The detectives proceeded to question others who knew both Glenn and Eli. One friend informed them that Eli had left town on April 19th, with Glenn still staying at Eli's house. When the friend returned on May 7th, Glenn was no longer there, and Eli claimed to have dropped him off at the bus station. However, Glenn's body was discovered on May 5th, a week before Eli said he had taken him to the bus station. Mark Taylor, Eli's neighbor on Banton Road, provided valuable information to the detectives a few days after they visited Eli's house. Mark mentioned that he frequently heard arguments between Eli and Glenn, but the last altercation occurred in mid-April, and he never saw Glenn again. The neighbor also reported that the day after the detectives questioned him, Eli came over and asked if one bullet could be traced back to a specific gun. Mark noticed that Eli had been increasingly nervous since Glenn's disappearance, but his anxiety worsened after the detectives spoke with him. The day after their visit, Mark saw Eli packing his truck, and he had not seen him since. It was later discovered that Eli had fled the area, and his whereabouts as well as the whereabouts of his son were unknown to the police, friends, and employees. Eli was now the primary suspect, and it was anticipated that more bodies would be discovered shortly. On June 16, 1985, Eli's roommate noticed him turning on the lights in their other roommate's bedroom. Eli asked to borrow some luggage, claiming that his lawyer had advised him to leave town. It struck the roommate as odd that a lawyer would suggest fleeing a murder investigation. Eli began packing his bags with clothes while mentioning that Danny, their missing roommate, was with friends. The roommate drove Eli to a deserted parking lot in a rural area, where Eli got out of the car with his loaded bags. Surprisingly, Eli's truck was nowhere to be found, and there was no one waiting to pick him up. The following day, the roommate contemplated the strange events and checked if his clothes had been packed, but they remained untouched. Eli had spent time with friends in New Mexico before traveling by bus to Wyoming, where he entrusted the care of Danny to Dean and Margie Barlow. Eli had met Dean at a Halloween party a few years earlier, and he and Danny had gone to Wyoming to spend Christmas with the Barlows. Eli convinced Dean and Margie to become Danny's legal guardians, fabricating a story about one of his employees being murdered in Austin, Texas, and his intention to track down the killer. However, Eli didn't make any genuine effort to pursue the murderer and instead traveled around, sharing the story of the murder and falsely claiming that the killer had used his .22 caliber rifle. He embellished the tale with unbelievable details, arousing suspicion among those who heard it. During his travels, Eli stayed at a friend's farm in Indiana, where the friend later expressed doubts about Eli's story and suspected that a murderer was staying on his property. Eli received calls and mail from unknown individuals, leading the friend to believe that Eli was meeting men through classified ads and using his farm as a base. After leaving Indiana, Eli went to Ohio, where he obtained a new driver's license and social security card using a different middle initial and birth date. He then returned to New Mexico, working and living on a farm. In October 1985, Dean Barlow dropped off Danny with Eli in New Mexico, planning for Danny to stay with his father permanently. However, Eli had other plans. He informed Dean during his return from Wyoming that the farm wasn't suitable for Danny, citing issues with the farm owner's drinking problem. Throughout this time, while living without his child, Eli sent letters to Danny's family, pretending that Danny was with him. He even forged a letter on Danny's behalf. As New Mexico was only a short drive from Durango, Eli frequented his old friends and parties in the area. In early November, Eli was fired from the farm due to inappropriate behavior, including walking around naked and engaging in indecent acts in front of his son. He moved to another farm, where the owner had several guns that were often left unattended in the farmhouse. On November 10th, a passenger on a train arriving in Durango spotted a body in the back of a pickup truck outside the automatic transmission exchange. The body was identified as David Taylor, a 36-year-old owner of the transmission shop, who had been bludgeoned to death. David had lived in Durango for about 3 years, and acquaintances described him as a laid-back person who occasionally used drugs but wasn't known for partying. The last sighting of David was at a gay party at a nearby Holiday Inn on November 8th. Authorities found David's vehicle in the hotel parking lot but had limited evidence to work with. On December 5th, Dennis Slater, a 24-year-old clerk at Junction Creek Liquors, was found shot to death in the store's basement. Dennis, who was about to graduate from Fort Lewis College, had been working part-time at the liquor store. Authorities discovered that money was missing from the cash register. On November 29th, Eli had made a $300 down payment on a 1975 AMC Gremlin at a nearby auto dealership. Just a week after the liquor store robbery and Dennis's murder, Eli returned to the dealership and paid another $300 to finalize the purchase. Shortly after Dennis's body was discovered, Eli's roommate discovered that 2 rifles were missing and confronted Eli about it. Eli, who had presented himself as an honest Amish man, denied ever touching the guns, which was a lie. On December 10th, Eli sold the rifles to a pawn shop for $210. He then hastily packed his car, intending to flee to Wyoming. Although he was supposed to pick up Danny, he had no plans of keeping him. Before leaving Durango, he sent a letter to a farmer in Missouri, whom he had met through a personal ad. In the letter, he mentioned that Danny might not be with him when he arrived, claiming that the boy wanted to spend Christmas with other family members. On December 24, 1985, Chuck Cleveland, driving his red Ford pickup, decided to go for a haircut and do some pheasant hunting near Chester, Nebraska. While scanning the fields, he noticed something blue on the side of the road. He stopped his truck and approached the object, only to discover it was the lifeless body of a child dressed in a blue sleeper covered in ice. Chuck used his CB radio to contact someone at the truck stop he owned in town, notifying them of the discovery and asking them to inform the sheriff. Sheriff Gary Young, accompanied by the coroner, headed to the scene. Although there had been recent snowfall, most of it had melted. The child's body was lying in the field, with one hand on his stomach and the other behind his back. The front of his face was missing, exposing nose cartilage, and there were bruises on his forehead and neck. When State Patrol investigators arrived, they observed that the blue sleeper appeared brand new and devoid of any wear. When the body was placed in a body bag, no evidence was found underneath, as if the body had simply appeared there. Nearby tire tracks were photographed, but authorities were not optimistic about their usefulness in identifying the killer. The body was found off the main highway, which was a heavily traveled road. It was sent to Lincoln for autopsy but had to thaw first, a process that took about a day and a half. The autopsy revealed that the boy had been in good health and well-nourished. The coroner noted the missing portions of the boy's face, which were likely caused by wild animals after the body was dumped. However, upon examining the skull, the investigators became puzzled as no injuries were found. The bruises on the forehead were explained as discoloration due to extremely cold temperatures. The same explanation applied to the bruising on the neck. There was no evidence of hemorrhaging or damage to the boy's neck muscles or hyoid bone. They not only had no idea who the boy was but also couldn't determine the cause of death. Detectives continued their investigation under the assumption that the boy had been murdered, considering that dumping a body strongly suggested foul play. It was still possible that the child had been suffocated. Eventually, another medical examiner would propose the possibility that the boy died from rapid freezing. During the initial autopsy, the dilation of the boy's anus led investigators to suspect sexual assault. However, subsequent tests came back negative, and there were no signs of any other objects being inserted into the boy's rectum. Anal dilation, along with the discoloration on the boy's head and neck, could be attributed to rapid freezing. It was speculated that the boy may have been unconscious but still alive when placed on the roadside, but the frigid temperatures would have caused him to freeze quickly. The local authorities had no information about the child's identity, and despite creating a composite sketch of the boy before his face was damaged by animals, they couldn't find any missing persons who matched his description. Flyers were distributed across the state and later the country, but they yielded no results. A mentally ill woman who was causing a disturbance at a cafe in town and claimed to have killed someone was briefly considered a suspect but was ultimately cleared. Tips came in from various locations, but none of them led to identifying the boy, who became known as Little Boy Blue. As time passed and leads turned into dead ends, authorities became more determined to discover his identity. The case garnered media attention, with stories published in USA Today and People magazine. Despite these efforts, the boy remained nameless as 1986 came to an end. In December 1985, Eli, leading a double life, visited 2 men he had met through personal ads. He fabricated stories about Danny staying with other family members for Christmas and losing his ranch after his lover died in a car accident. He also falsely claimed to have recently tested negative for AIDS. Eli went to Ohio, spent Christmas with friends, and told people that Danny was participating in ski competitions and winning races. By February 1986, Eli had relocated to Azle, Texas. In April, he first mentioned Danny's death, stating that he had died in a car accident in Salt Lake City, involving the Barlows. He lied to friends and sent a letter to the Gingerich family, falsely stating that Danny was happy and involved in a soccer program. In July 1986, the Gingerich family received a letter from Eli explaining Danny's supposed car accident death. However, the Barlows and the Gingerich family became suspicious of the information's veracity. Amos Gingerich, Danny's father, attempted to find the cemetery where Danny was supposedly buried but was unsuccessful. He then traveled to Wyoming to seek out the Barlows but found no evidence of the accident or their involvement. Despite their efforts, they hit dead ends in their search for answers. In December 1987, an article titled "Little Boy Blue of Chester, Nebraska" was published in Reader's Digest, spreading the story of the unidentified boy found 2 years earlier. The Barlows, although in denial about Eli's potential involvement, noticed the similarity between the boy's appearance and Danny's. However, they convinced themselves that the location of Chester was not on Eli's route between Wyoming and Ohio, and they should have been far past that point by the time the boy was found. Nonetheless, Margie Barlow sent a letter to the Chester police with a picture of Danny, providing investigators with a potential identity for the boy and leading them to search for his father. As investigators delved into Eli's life, they discovered that he had 2 different IDs, each with distinct personal information. They learned about his wife's death, his frequent relocations, and the murder of his roommate. These findings, along with the information about someone else known to Eli being dumped in a ditch, increased suspicions about him. Eli had allowed his ranch in Durango to go into foreclosure, and the person who bought it was making monthly payments to Eli. Authorities traced these payments to an address in Azle, Texas. They informed the local police chief, Ted Garber, about their search for Eli in his town. Chief Garber found Eli's stolen truck in an old trailer park and called for backup. Eli was arrested on December 14, 1987, and charged with felony child abuse. When he was apprehended, he had no pictures of Danny on his person, but he possessed fake identification, a social security card, and business cards. Chief Garber interviewed Eli, starting with questions about his wife's death, and then inquired about Glenn Pritchett, as Eli's gun had been involved in the murder. He claimed that he was awakened in the middle of the night by a heated argument in his living room. Suddenly, he heard a gunshot and then everything went quiet. When he went to the living room to investigate, he discovered that everyone had disappeared. He didn't know who exactly had been present. If his story was true, then why did he fabricate a tale about taking Glenn to the bus station when the police questioned him about Glenn's whereabouts? The only reason someone would invent a story to explain someone's disappearance is if they were involved in it. The police didn't suspect him initially because they were unaware that he owned guns. It wasn't until they asked him why he left Austin the day after being questioned that they discovered he had firearms. Eli couldn't provide a satisfactory answer, and he abandoned the story about his lawyer advising him to leave town, likely because he knew an experienced police officer like Garber would see through the lie. When asked about Danny, Eli claimed that when he picked him up from the Barlows, the boy was ill, and the Barlow had given him medication. As they traveled, Danny's condition worsened and he refused to eat. They stopped at a truck stop in Salina, Kansas, but Danny didn't eat much. Eli changed Danny into blue pajamas and wrapped him in a blanket in the back of the Gremlin, where the boy fell asleep. At some point, Eli noticed that Danny's eyes had rolled to the back of his head. He decided to stop and leave Danny somewhere where God could find him. Interestingly, the place he believed God would find him was also a location where people wouldn't. He could have dropped him off at a hospital or fire station, but instead, he chose the side of a desolate road. How did he end up in Chester? He was traveling from Lyman, Wyoming, which is located in the southwest corner of the state. The most direct route to Salina, Kansas, would have been to go from Cheyenne to Denver and then head east on I-70. However, if he was heading back to Ohio, there would be no reason for him to take that route. The truth was that Eli was heading to Salina to stay with a man he had met through a classified ad. If Eli had continued on I-80 past Cheyenne, he would have entered Nebraska. If he then exited I-80 and headed south on Highway 81 for about an hour, he would have reached Chester. Another hour and 20 minutes south would have taken him to Salina. Eli arrived at his friend's house in Salina around 7 a.m. on December 15, 1985. He must have left Danny's body on the side of the road just hours before. When Garber asked Eli where he had gone after leaving Danny on the side of the road, Eli lied and said he went to Ohio. However, it was later revealed that he went to Salina and spent time with one man, and then he went to Missouri and spent time with another man. Eli had written a letter to the second man, informing him that Danny might not be with them when he arrived. This letter was written before he picked up Danny from the Barlows, indicating that he had already planned to harm the boy. During the background investigation of Eli, it was discovered that he had tested positive for HIV. Not only had he indirectly caused the death of a young person, but he was also endangering countless other lives by falsely claiming that he had tested negative. Eli was extradited to Nebraska to stand trial there. When he was booked into the county jail, he requested Grecian formula to maintain the appearance of his hair. However, authorities couldn't find any evidence to definitively prove that Eli caused Danny's death. Eventually, they allowed him to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanors, abandoning a body and concealing a death. He was sentenced to 18 months for these crimes, but that wasn't the end of his time behind bars. After completing his sentence in Nebraska, he was sent back to Texas to stand trial for the murder of Glenn Pritchett. The jury found him guilty and he received a 40-year prison sentence. While in prison, he corresponded with some family members who hoped that he would eventually confess to his other crimes. However, he continued to maintain his innocence. In a letter to a friend, he claimed that he was fighting to uncover the truth about his son's death and mentioned that 5 other children had died from an unknown illness in Wyoming. However, this was a lie. At the same time, investigators were attempting to gather evidence linking him to the murders of David Taylor and Annette Slater in Durango. Dennis died just days before Eli left town, which became a recurring pattern for him. Detectives tried to compare fingerprints, but the existing records were insufficient for a conclusive comparison. They asked Eli for fingerprints and DNA samples, but he refused. It was surprising that he said that he was awakened in the middle of the night by an argument in his living room. He heard a gunshot and then it became silent. When he went to check, everyone was gone and he didn't know who had been there. However, when the police asked about Glenn, he made up a story about taking him to the bus station instead of telling them the truth. One reason people make up stories to explain someone's disappearance is because they are involved in it. The police didn't question him initially because they didn't know he had guns until they asked him about leaving Austin after being questioned. Eli couldn't give a satisfactory answer, and he dropped the story about his lawyer telling him to leave town. Eli claimed that when he picked up Danny from the Barlows, the boy was sick and they had given him medication. As they traveled, Danny's condition worsened and he stopped eating. They made a stop at a truck stop, but Danny didn't eat much. Eli changed Danny into blue pajamas, wrapped him in a blanket, and put him to sleep in the back of the Gremlin. At some point, Eli noticed that Danny's eyes had rolled to the back of his head, so he decided to leave him somewhere where God could find him. Surprisingly, he chose a desolate road instead of a hospital or fire station. Eli was coming from Lyman, Wyoming, and the best way to get to Salina, Kansas would have been to go from Cheyenne to Denver and then head east on I-70. However, if he was heading back to Ohio, there would be no reason for him to take that route. The truth is that Eli was going to Salina to stay with someone he met through a classified ad. If he continued on I-80 past Cheyenne, he would have entered Nebraska, and by heading south on Highway 81 for about an hour, he would have reached Chester. Eli arrived in Salina at around 7 a.m. on December 15, 1985. He must have left Danny's body on the side of the road just hours before. When asked where he went after leaving Danny, Eli lied and said he went to Ohio, but he actually went to Salina, spent time with someone, and then went to Missouri to see another person. Eli had written a letter to the second person, mentioning that Danny might not be with them when he arrived. This letter was written before he picked up Danny from the Barlows, indicating that he had already planned to harm the boy. During Eli's background investigation, it was discovered that he tested positive for HIV, putting many lives at risk by falsely claiming he tested negative. Eli was extradited to Nebraska to stand trial there. When he was booked into the county jail, he requested Grecian formula for his hair. However, authorities couldn't find enough evidence to prove that Eli caused Danny's death. Eventually, he pleaded guilty to abandoning a body and concealing a death, receiving an 18-month sentence. But that wasn't the end of his time in prison. After completing his Nebraska sentence, he was sent back to Texas to stand trial for the murder of Glenn Pritchett. He was found guilty and sentenced to 40 years in prison. While in prison, he maintained his innocence but corresponded with some family members. In 2002, Eli was released on parole and settled in the Fort Worth area, where he made a living selling handcrafted leather goods. He would sometimes admit to his neighbors that he had been in prison but would claim it was for drugs while telling a few others that it was for murder but still asserting his innocence. He deceived most people by claiming he had never been married or had children. However, he did confide in one neighbor, telling them that he was a widower and had left his son with his family after leaving the church due to his homosexuality. Eli continued to live for another 5 years, primarily in his one-bedroom apartment where he frequently smoked crack. Eventually he caused another death, but this time it was his own. In January of 2007, Eli's landlord confronted him about a bounced rent check. Eli resorted to fabricating another lie, claiming that his checkbook had been stolen and his account emptied. He assured the landlord that he would pay the rent as soon as possible, although he had no intention of doing so. Towards the end of January, Eli deliberately cut his left arm, lay down on the couch, covered himself with a comforter, and watched television until he died. A concerned friend, who hadn't heard from Eli in several days, contacted the police to request a welfare check. It was during this check that Eli's body was discovered. An autopsy and evidence found at the scene concluded that there was no foul play involved, and his death was determined to be a suicide. Many people are upset that 4 out of the 5 victims believed to be Eli's will never receive justice. Some individuals also speculate that if authorities had investigated the bonfire incident in 1977, it would have become evident that Eli murdered Ida and their unborn child. This may have prevented him from harming others in the future. Eli walked a dangerous line between two worlds, using one to shield himself from the consequences of the other. He played the part of the naive Amish man, convincing those around him that he was too innocent, too simple, to be capable of true evil. At the same time, he preyed on the fears of the gay community, knowing that many victims would stay silent rather than risk exposure. But here's the chilling question: how many more victims were there? How many crimes went unnoticed, hidden beneath the facade he so carefully crafted? The truth may never fully come to light, but one thing is certain: Eli will be remembered not for his innocence, but for the darkness he concealed. What do you think? Could there be even more to this story? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest true crime stories.